This screencast, part of my lessons preparing students for OCR New A-Level, Chaucer's Merchant's Tale, is an introduction to the character of January, the character at the centre of the tale. And whether or not you've read the tale already, or perhaps an overview of it, I'd like you to begin by spending some time thinking about the connotations of the name. Everything that appears in writing and literature has been chosen for a reason, and we need to just begin to help our minds open up to the reasoning behind this name. So what I suggest you do in a moment is pause the screencast, get a piece of paper and just start jotting down the things that come into your mind relating to the name January. So pause now and pick it up when you're ready. So the ideas that I want to explore in this screencast, and it may well be that you come up with many more, and it may well be, if we're working on this in class, that we come up with many more, and come up with more during the reading of the tale, are these: Janus, the Roman god who gives his name to the month January, the idea of January being a month in midwinter, not the first month of the new year, but actually one of the last months of the old year, and the idea of age, again using the year in this way as an allegory for age and for the life cycle, if you like. The cycle of the year begins not in January, but in spring, of course, probably in April. And the idea, therefore, that by the time we reach January, we really are in old age. So to look at them in order, Janus, the Roman god of beginnings, was usually depicted as a two-faced god, looking both forward and back. He establishes, therefore, a sense of duality that does run throughout the tale. Pairing is very common in this tale. We see that January has two advisors. There are two religions that seem to operate throughout the tale, quite happily interweaving with each other. And also that January seems to have two ideas of what married life may be for, or what he might get from it. It's also worth remembering that January is the month in which Janus oversaw the revelry of the turning of the year. Although January is old, January in medieval pictorial calendar was often portrayed as, here in the image I've just popped on this slide, as wealthy, as benefiting from all the good husbandry of the months that have gone before, a man enjoying his wealth and his luxury in life. This doesn't seem too far away from the January in terms of the descriptions of his palace at the wedding, and nor does it seem too far away from the merchant himself who's telling the tale, who seems to be, according to Chaucer anyway, obsessed by his gaining of wealth in every way. Looking beyond Janus, looking at winter, the season of death and the end of the year, and so we have a very clear allegory set up quite quickly. If January is redolent of old age and death, May, who he will of course marry, is redolent of spring and summer, the idea of life bursting into fruitfulness, renewal, prosperity, and all these things. And it's a very clear idea that these two ideas are not quite going to coincide. This therefore links to the idea of age within the name. In the story, January is 60. That's old for medieval times. And it's very clear in line 205 that he wants a bride who is not yet 20 years old. Chaucer makes a great deal of his age. After the first sexual encounter, the focus is on the grotesqueness of his looks, with a slacker skin about his neck a shacketh, and so on. Before he has sex, although he is very clearly driven by a huge sexual desire, and is very, shall we say, self-aware or possibly self-unaware of issues around his virility, it is also very clear that he can't bed May without having read his Joy of Sex of the medieval day, the De Coitu, and taken various stimulants to ensure that his performance is as good as it might be. Despite all this, May is actually not impressed by him. She praiseth not his playing worth a boon. She really does suggest that he has failed utterly in his sexual act. And this allegory is very clear. It's very caustic and rather cruel in tone, and might therefore be seen as being typical of fabliaux, this type of writing we've discussed before, where the level of characterization is actually really not terribly sophisticated, and we're dealing with low-class, rough ideas, with a moral to come through at the end. And all this would be fine if there weren't so much more to this character, and therefore to this tale. Sir January, although never expressed as such, he is a knight. We're told that very clearly at the beginning, and he's a knight of Lombardy, of a very, very wealthy part of Italy. He has the highest station on the social ladder beneath that of royalty, and this should confer certain behaviours in line with chivalry. And you will be asked to, if you haven't already, go and look at the general prologue and go and look at the depiction of the knight there, and also read a summary of the knight's tale, this tale of courtly love and chivalry. There should be a type of behaviour in the knight which is clearly absent in January. And we then need to wonder whether this depiction of the knight as lecherous and senile and everything a knight shouldn't be was not possibly dangerous for somebody at that time to be making. It's a time when knights, just below the level of king, really did have control of everything that happened. And Chaucer has suffered at the hands of various knights during his life. He's also benefited. If the money that John of Gaunt was giving him can be seen as a benefit, it obviously can, but the fact that it's been given partly as a recompense for the fact that Chaucer's wife was part of Gaunt's entourage, possibly more than that at some time. And Chaucer chooses to tell this tale in the character of a merchant, again a man of his own background and the type of man amongst whom he's worked, and again suffered some injustices, we believe, but certainly will have seen at first hand whilst working in the wool office in London. And again, we wonder how much of Chaucer's life colours his tale of January. Whether it does or not, the fundamental is that January is the centre of a comedy and consequently has to be treated as such. He's duped, he's cuckolded, and he either doesn't see it or chooses not to see it, and the irony that builds up through the tale, leading to his eventual blinding and then regaining of his sight, at which point he fails to see what is in front of him again, is, I think, utterly obvious and will be something that's discussed throughout the teaching of this text. Lines 225 to 228 tell us very clearly that he's worried about his heir and wants to achieve the fact that he has an heir before it's too late. He's concerned that all his heritage, everything he's worked for, will go to waste. Perhaps he's avaricious, just like the merchant in this way. We've already commented about the grotesque physical descriptions, and we need to keep those in the front of our mind. They're so vivid. And I think there is also humour in some of the issues around sin, and although this is a time of very strong religious conviction and moral tales around the 7 deadly sins abound at this time, and if you've read the Pardoner's Tale, for example, it's a very good example of how this preaching form of tale can be used in this way. We have in January, it seems, both avarice and lust, and there is humour here in his inability to see what's going on. Lust, lechery, was a sin in medieval England. Any sex outside marriage was a sin, but also, once one was married, sex within marriage was not deemed sinful as long as it was for the purposes of begetting children, and there was no other form of sex that was not deemed to be lecherous or sinful. Known as paying one's debts to one's spouse, sex for pleasure was a sin. Now, commentators will argue endlessly about the level of sinfulness here, But I think the point that we look at when we look at this with January, and we see the degree to which he has always indulged himself in sinful sex, in lechery, in suffering from the sin of lust. There is a humour in the fact that he doesn't seem to be able to see this. It's also, of course, a sin enshrined in the Ten Commandments to commit adultery. And given that this story hinges on the adulterous relationship between Damian and May, January's response to that is something that we need to consider. There's no doubt, however, that he is as lecherous as Damian. We're very clear right at the beginning of the tale, 37-38, that he has always followed his bodily delight on woman, thereas was his appetite. He's done what on earth he feels like doing it whenever he's felt like doing it with any woman who's ever been around him. Set against that, he's now considering his marriage, and on line 60 he's considering the fact that he wants to be engendered of an heir. That's legitimate. That's what marriage is for in terms of the relationship between man and woman. Having said that, the way in which he goes about it owes far more to lust than any loving relationship. In his herte, he gan herte menas, that he that nicht in armes wod he straina. These two verbs, menas and straina, are so savage and harsh. This speaks far more of sort of unbridled passion than anything else. He tells May that a man may do no sin with his wife. This is palpably untrue, and we might want to think about why he's saying it. Does he believe it to be true? Whatever we find here, it seems that he does have double standards, and one of your tasks will need to be to collect examples of his double standards, not just around the idea of lust, but generally as you read. And this makes him no different to the Damian, who is spotlit so beautifully in line 1045 when Pluto and Proserpina are looking at the tree. Lo, where he sit, the lecher in the tree. It could hardly be clearer there, sitting within its caesure, the lecher, the idea of this man who is only fixed on one thing, and the actual moment of consummation, regardless of the time that has been spent pining in love and the letters that have gone between the two, and the illusion that has been built up of some emotional link between May and Damian. As soon, suddenly, as May has reached the top of the ladder, Damian gan pullen up the smock, and in he throng. That verb throng, thrust. There's no sense of love here at all. This is pure, unbridled lust, lechery. And is there any difference really between Damian and January as far as this is concerned? Probably not. Indeed, January can be seen quite regularly in an unpleasant light. We've talked about the physical descriptions, and we've also touched on the lexis used around his lovemaking. It is always seen as work, business. He describes himself as a workman as he's telling May what he's going to do to her on the wedding night. She will have to endure him. His courage is sharp and keen. He menaces her. There are so many of these verbs chosen because of their strength and power, and you do need to find them. There is an element in this man that he is avaricious. He is very keen to present his wealth ostentatiously at the wedding, but also to make sure that everything is safeguarded, that he has worked hard for all his life. And there is a genuine sense of repulsion at the sensory imagery of the wax that men shall play with their hands to mould a woman to their liking, particularly when seen in the hands of this old man. But there's more to this tale. There are also sympathies that can be set up for January. There are the ironies set up by his potential senility, and the fact that he doesn't seem to be able to see what he is saying when he's talking about the ideal woman, and he's saying better than old beef is a tender veal. The reader, the audience of the day, will see very clearly that it is he that is the old beef in this analogy. Yet he thinks he's talking about the reasons to have a young wife. It might be that when he's singing after having managed sex, if that's what's happened on the wedding night, that we need see no more in this than his sheer joy at having found what he wanted. That, to me, is potentially something that could make us sympathetic towards him. And I think also his genuine concern for Damian when he thinks him ill, something that Chaucer tells us, makes everybody think the better of him, is touching and is right. This is how the knight should behave. His serving man is ill, and January is deeply solicitous of him. Of course, the irony is that in doing so, he enables the deception to take place. At the end of the story, there is a suggestion that he will continue to love, maybe, but certainly behave well towards May. And again, maybe that is something that we need to take as a mark in his favour. And it happens after the scene in the love garden. The love garden, which he has built as a gift and a statement of his love, and that would be enough were it not for the connotations of love gardens generally. They are representations of a paradise on earth, and just as God created Eden for Adam and Eve to play in, so January has created this locus amenus, as they're called, for he and May. And the idea is that they go in through their locked door and get up to whatever they want in this garden. And Chaucer's quite clear that they do things in this garden that they don't feel able to do in the bedroom. So one wonders exactly what the levels of January's depravity are. But within any Eden, if we keep this analogy, there has to be already present the potential for the fall to take place. God created Eden and put a tree in it that he said nobody was to eat the fruit of. Temptation. He also did little, if we read Paradise Lost and or Genesis, to really prevent Satan from entering the garden. At the centre of January's garden there is a fruit tree, another opportunity for woman to fall, exactly as Eve did in Eden. There is always a discussion when one reads a text like Paradise Lost, a parallel text for study at this level, as to whether God intended the fall to happen or somehow deliberately created the mechanism whereby the fall could happen in order to test mankind. And I think when we've read the whole story, and particularly in light of January's eventual coming to terms with what's happened and his behaviour towards May at the very end, whether we might see here a sense that, albeit unwittingly, let's face it, he never sees the consequences of anything he says or does, he has created the environment for this to happen. Is there a way in which the fall could be attractive for January, even if he didn't actually want to see it physically taking place? As they leave the tale on line 1202, on her womba he stroketh here full softer. He's stroking her womb, her stomach. He wants an heir. There may be a pregnancy. If there is a pregnancy, it seems far more likely that this heir will be Damian's son, rather than his own, based on what we've seen during the tale. But he seems not too bothered by that. You can take that where you need to. And I imagine that the theme of the garden will be discussed in all your lessons. Now, that brings me to the end of what I usefully want to talk about at this stage, so as not to overload this talk. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your studies.